Today's lesson is Monopoly. So you've seen this wonderful board game, Monopoly, and if you remember that game, when you make a monopoly is when you own all of the streets of one color, right? Or in one neighborhood. So when you are the only person who is the possessor of a certain area. So that's the definition of monopoly. It's a single seller of a product without close substitutes. This is without, which makes it very inelastic, right? Remember, elasticity is when things have a lot of substitutes. So a monopoly faces an inelastic demand because the buyers are kind of stuck with that. They don't have any other choice. And that creates market power. So market power is an economic term, which means the ability to influence the market price. Okay, so it's the opposite of market of price taker, right? So that's why monopolies usually make a lot of money, because they have that influence over the market price. They have market power. And the source of a monopoly is barriers to entry, right? So because there are barriers to entry, other firms cannot enter the market and benefit from that industry. It helps here when we do this lesson. It helps a lot to take a look at your notes from perfect competition and do a compare contrast with that. Then you can understand both of them better. Okay, so barriers to entry means that other people can't come in, so you can kind of have more influence. A monopolist faces the market demand alone, which means that they face a downward sloping demand curve. So the regular demand curve, basically. As opposed to a perfectly competitive firm, which faces a perfectly elastic demand, because there are a lot of substitutes for it. Okay, and it has a horizontal demand. It faces a horizontal demand, and that's what makes it a price taker. So that's the difference between a monopoly and perfectly competitive firm. Pause here. The main reason why there are monopolies, or there can be monopolies, is barriers to entry, right? So what are barriers to entry? One of them is a case of monopoly resource, and that's when there is only one owner. So the resource is owned by a single firm, and that's going to create a monopoly. An example of that, you might have heard of De Beers. They controlled about 90% of the world's production of diamonds in the 80s. Right now it's dropped to just over 30%, but if you think of 90%, that's a lot. Like really, they could determine the price of diamonds. Okay, another example that's somewhat similar is OPEC, right? The Organization of Oil Exporting Countries. So they, at some point, especially in the 70s, they could influence the price of oil a lot. Right? Now, this is not that common. Another example your book gives is, let's say you have a small town and there's a well. There's only a single well in the town, and anyone who wants to get the water has to go through that well. So the owner of that well can determine the price. Something that's more common is government-created monopolies through patents and copyrights, right? So the patents and copyrights are applicable to things like pharmaceuticals, or whenever there is some new discovery or invention or new program or a formula or whatever. If you come up with a design, you can register for a patent, which means that you are the only person who is entitled to make profit out of that. All right, so that's protected by the law. The law is going to protect you against competition. All right, and this is basically to give incentive to the research and development. Research and development takes a lot of effort and investment. So to give incentive to them, we say, okay, you know what? If you come up with a new invention, you can be the sole producer for a number of years. A third type of barrier to entry is natural monopolies. And that's when the cost of production is lowest if there's only one firm. So it actually makes sense to have only one firm. And that occurs when you have economies of scale. So you've seen this concept before, economies of scale. And that's when, another name for it is increasing returns to scale. So that's when the average total cost falls as the firm's scale becomes larger. So as output increases, the average total cost decreases because of high setup costs. So for instance, you have distribution of water or power. It's not efficient to have more than one line. All right. So for instance, you have Hydro-Quebec or Via Rail and roads and bridges. So here's the thing. Just think of pipelines in a city, right? It makes sense to have only one pipeline. You don't want to have just for the sake of competition. Let's have a lot of pipelines. That's not efficient. Or power lines. You don't want to have like all different power lines on top of one another when one would be enough, right? Another example is a bridge, right? If you have a bridge and assuming that there's not that much demand for traffic, then that one bridge is enough. You just build one bridge. Okay, so if that bridge has a cost, if there is an entrance fee, for instance, then that's a monopoly. All right. So one thing to note here is when we say natural doesn't mean something that exists in nature. Natural means that the nature of the product, the essence of the product requires and necessitates, a single seller. Pause here and write down. The profit maximization condition, which is applicable all the time, is this marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Let's see how that works and why it's so important. Let's look at an example. Let's say your marginal cost is 5 and your marginal revenue is 7. Before we go on, you have to interpret what marginal cost means and what marginal revenue means. Okay? So if you remember, the main concept in marginal cost and marginal revenue is an extra unit of output. So if you make an extra unit of output, you're going to earn $7. That's your marginal revenue. And you're going to lose $5. That's your marginal cost. So overall, is it a good idea to make that extra unit? Are you going to make some profit because of that? Yeah, your profit is going to increase by $2. So it's actually profitable to increase your output, right? So the right decision, whenever marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, the right decision is to increase your production, because by increasing production, you're earning something. But then as your output increases, then marginal cost is going to increase also because of diminishing marginal returns. This diminishing marginal returns is what you've seen before. The example of the lawnmower, if you remember, right? You have only one lawnmower, and as you add more and more workers, they're not going to contribute as much as the last person, right? And because marginal cost increases, at some point you reach that condition of marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Let's look at another example. Let's say marginal cost is 5 and marginal revenue is 2. Now in this case, if you make an extra unit, what's going to happen to your profit? You should be able to figure out the math, right? If you make an extra unit, your cost goes up by 5, your revenue goes up by 2. So when you take your notes, make sure you fill in the blank. Now, if you cut your production by 1 unit, by cutting the production, you're going to save $5 of cost, and you're going to miss $2 of revenue, which means your profit is actually going to increase, right? It's going to increase by $3 because you're saving. So it's profitable to reduce your output because you're saving costs, all right? So as output goes down, then marginal cost is going to go down until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So again, we're going to reach the same condition as before. In other words, the moral of the story is this. Either marginal cost is less or greater than marginal revenue. And in either case, the right thing to do is going to lead us to the point where the two balance out. So that's kind of like our equilibrium. Pause here. All right, let's see what happens when a monopolist sells an extra unit of output, right? There are two things that happen. One of them is called the output effect, which is that when the quantity goes up, then total revenue goes up, right? You're selling more, so you make more revenue. But that's not the only thing that happens. There's also something called the price effect. The monopolist has to lower its price to sell more units because there is a single price that affects all units. Okay, because the price has, remember the law of demand, basically, if you want to sell more units, you have to lower the price. That's the idea. Okay, so because of that, there is a negative thing here. So you have two elements that oppose each other. And basically, the monopolist has to decide a point where the increase dominates the decrease. Okay, so that really depends, that determines what's going to be the optimum quantity. For a competitive firm, there is no price effect because they are a price taker. So a competitive firm is a small person that doesn't affect anything. That's why the price is fixed for them. All right. For a monopoly, the marginal revenue is less than the price because they're facing the entire market. So they have to choose the quantity based on marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But for a competitive firm, you have this thing, which is marginal revenue equals price, and that's only for a competitive firm. In other words, a monopolist faces a dilemma, right? On the one hand, there is the increase, on the other hand, there is a decrease. So they're like, oh no, what should I do, right? And the answer is you set your marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So that's gonna like our general universal law. Nice. This is an extremely important slide and you might need to watch it again. We're gonna do graphs and I'm gonna walk you through, so make sure you watch carefully, and when you do the graph, make a very large and neat one for yourself. So we're gonna have our good old price and quantity, and you have the marginal cost of a monopolist and the demand curve of the market. Okay, now the marginal revenue is gonna look something like that. It's similar to the demand but steeper. Okay, and to find the optimal quantity, we have to set marginal revenue equal marginal cost. So if you look at the graph, what point is there? What's the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? You have to find the intersection, right? So that's gonna be the point which gives us the quantity. So the corresponding quantity is the quantity of a monopolist. The optimal production choice of a monopolist is QM. All right? And that's the profit maximizing output. Now, to find the price, this is where it gets tricky. To find the price, you have to be very careful, right? The price is determined by the demand curve. This is important. We're talking about the demand curve at the quantity of the optimal quantity M. Okay, so you have to go up to the demand curve, you find a point there, and then you find the corresponding price. So the optimal profit maximizing price of a monopolist is PM. All right, now if you remember, we had this formula for profit, which is total revenue minus total cost, and total revenue is the same as price times quantity. And total cost is the same as average total cost times quantity, right? So because we have two quantities, we can factor them out, right? So we can simplify this by writing quantity times price minus average total cost. So we want to show the profit on a graph, all right? This is where it might get a little bit messy. That's why you need to have a large graph. But basically, you will need to draw your average total cost. Okay, so you draw your average total cost, and that's a U-shaped graph, and you find the point on the quantity for average total cost. Okay, so using the formula for profit, you can now show your profit on the graph. It's going to be the area, the shaded area, the green shaded area, that's the profit of a monopolist. Okay, again, you might want to watch this again, but whenever you have questions to do, it's not going to be more complicated than this, all right? So you have a bunch of graphs there, and you have a shaded area, which is the profit. Pause here and take your time to do a neat job. If you can, do some color coding to make it neat. Price discrimination. One word of caution here is about this word discrimination. This is a taboo, and we kind of always have a negative connotation with it. In economics, when we say discrimination, we just mean it in a literal sense, which means difference. So price discrimination means different prices. So don't get it mixed with the everyday sense of discrimination. Price discrimination means selling the same product at different prices to different customers. Okay, so you have the same camera that's sold for $199 to one person and $349 to another person, right? And this is only possible if you have some market power. You need to be a powerful seller to be able to discriminate, right? And the reason why they do it is to make more profit. This is according to their willingness to pay. So in this case, the student, for instance, can't afford so much, so they're offered a lower price. The other guy who has more income, they're offered a higher price. And the idea is that the seller wants to suck out all of the willingness to pay of the customers. consumer surplus is turned into producer surplus. So CS goes down, PS goes up. All right, so that's the idea of price discrimination. And there are certain conditions for it. So one condition is market power. Market power means that you should be able to influence the market price. That's why a price taker can't determine the price. Okay, so a price taker, like a competitive firm, they can't discriminate. They just have to follow the market price. You also need to know the willingness to pay of the consumers. If you want to make a distinction between the different buyers, then you need to know who is willing to pay more and who is willing to pay less. And there should be no arbitrage. So arbitrage is when buyers buy the good at the lower price and then resell it at the higher price. So that's going to reduce or take away the monopolist's profit. Okay, so here's an example of arbitrage. Let's say you have a low market, you have a cheap market where ice cream is sold for $1, right? Now you could, if you exist in that low market, you could buy it there for $1 and you can go to the high end and sell it for $5. If you were to do that, then the ice cream seller kind of you're competing with them, right? But if there is no arbitrage, then the monopolist can have more benefit. Price discrimination is when the seller sucks the life out of the buyers. All right, so this reminds me of a clip which is kind of nice, so let's watch it. All right, so the idea is that, yeah, it's kind of related to traveling in groups. If the seller can single out the buyers, then they can take advantage of them, right? If they can't single out the buyers, then they can't, right? So it really depends on if you can discriminate or not. Wow, that was cool. All right, let's look at the different forms of price discrimination. There is first degree price discrimination, which is perfect, and that is when the seller charges everyone their willingness to pay. So they really suck out everything. But that's not realistic. Usually it's not possible because the willingness to pay is not known. Okay, so that's not very practical. There is second degree price discrimination, which is among the units sold. So what is that? So you charge different prices to the same customer for different units bought. Because the more of a product that one consumes, their willingness to pay for an additional one drops. You've seen this before. Remember, we had an example about Timbits. If you're starving, you would value the first Timbit a lot more than the second Timbit and more than the third and so forth, right? If you're not starving, if you already had a box of Timbits and somebody offers you one more, then you're not going to value that as much, right? So the sellers know that and they can use this. So you might have seen this, buy one and the second one is half price. Well, guess what? That's really being ripped off. So this is useful for everyday life. Don't be deceived. Don't be fooled, right? There is this idea of psychological impact that entices the buyers to think that they're saving. You're not really saving. You're just giving up all of your willingness to pay. Another example is, let's say a small popcorn is $3 and a large one, which is twice as big, is worth $4, right? So if you think of that, it doesn't add up mathematically, but it's actually a form of price discrimination. Another example is a single donut is $1. A dozen should be 12, but they usually sell it less than 12, let's say $10, right? So the idea is that the actual price is the $4 for a big one. But for the smaller one, they raise the price a little bit to capture all of the willingness to pay. Third degree price discrimination is based on market segments. So different groups of consumers are charged different prices. And that's called market segmentation, which is by things like age, region, employment status, family status, things that are correlated with the consumer's willingness to pay. Okay, so the idea is that a lot of times, for instance, what you have is younger people have a lower willingness to pay. So what you do is you make a separate category for youth, right? And you sell the product at a cheaper price and so forth. The market is segmented into buyers with different elasticities of demand. This, by the way, is width, okay? So based on their elasticities, you charge them a different price. Those who have a more elastic demand, you charge them cheaper. Those who have more inelastic demand, you charge them more expensive. So for instance, student or senior discounts, because they usually have a lower willingness to pay. Now, the kind of interesting thing is that student discounts don't work for all products. So certain items like movies, sometimes you have to pay actually the same price because there is good demand for it, right? Also with the elderly, when they want to buy medicine, because they need it, it's actually very inelastic, then there is no discount just for being old, right? I mean, unless there's government help, but that's a different thing. The fourth type is called hurdle pricing, and that's basically when you pay more to obtain it sooner, okay? And hurdle pricing is really another form of segmentation. So the fourth type is really a subcategory of the third type. You are segmenting the people based on their level of patience. So it's kind of like an impatience tax. So when you have a long line of people waiting for something, like a newly released device, and there is this one person who say, no, I don't want to stay all this long line. So they would be willing to pay a higher price to get it sooner, right? So this is about, the early orders and all that. It's not that the price is going to fall later because of technology. No, it's not because of that. It's just that the higher price at the beginning is to suck out the higher willingness to pay of the impatient buyers. Okay, another example is grocery coupons. So with grocery coupons, what you have is that you need to take the time to go through that flyer, right? And that has opportunity cost. People with higher income usually don't take the time to go through the flyers and cut out, the coupons, right? People with lower income would do that. So what they do is that they set the price a little bit higher for everyone, but then they give out coupons that only the low income people would use. Another example is airline or bus tickets. If you buy a ticket last minute, usually it's more expensive because last minute is kind of like, the impatient, people who couldn't plan ahead and things like that. So you're going to charge them. They usually have a higher willingness to pay if they want to buy last minute. Pause here. One of the most central concepts in economics is efficiency. And that means maximizing total surplus. All right, we had a formula for that: consumer surplus added to producer surplus. So adding the consumer's benefit to the producer's benefit, that gives us the total social welfare, social well-being. Okay, it means making the pie as big as possible. So we are trying to maximize the size of the pie, and pi represents, the total value that's produced. Regardless of how it's sliced or distributed. So if you have a pie, we are not really concerned about fairness here. It's not about equity, but it's about the size of the pie. The reason why in economics we don't care about this slicing of the pie is that slicing is a subjective matter. Okay, and it's very hard to arrive at a consensus about it, and it's not quantifiable. All right. Now there are three conditions for efficiency. One is, who should consume the good? Well, if you want to be efficient, the buyer who values it the most, those buyers should consume the good. Okay. And valuing the good, we had a term for it. That was the highest willingness to pay. So those who really want it, those are the ones who should get it. Like, oh no, I'm not gonna make it. Yeah. The second question to answer is, who should produce it? Well, if you want to be efficient, then the producer who can produce it at the lowest possible cost, right? So that would be the most efficient producer. And the total surplus will not increase if more or less quantity is produced. So that's the third condition. So the condition is that we cannot do better by either reducing or increasing our production. If that's the case, then we are maximizing our efficiency. All right. Now, the opposite of that is when you have a deadweight loss. So deadweight loss, or DWL, is a fall in total surplus. It's a loss of social welfare. Now, when does it happen? So for instance, if you have a monopoly, or if there's a tax, or if there's a price control like a minimum wage, for instance, or a price ceiling, or there is an externality. Okay, so whenever the market doesn't work, basically, whenever the competitive market cannot produce the item, then you get deadweight loss. And we're going to look at some example of that. All right, but that basically means a case of inefficiency. There are two main types of efficiency. One of them is called allocative efficiency, which is when resources are used for producing what is most wanted by the society. Okay, so basically the price here shows the value of the item to the society, which is the marginal benefit, should equal the marginal cost. Okay, so the price is the worth of an additional unit of a good or service, so that's called the marginal benefit. And marginal cost, you've seen it before, is the cost of an additional unit of a good or service. So these two should equal. The other type is productive efficiency, which is the least costly production techniques are being used. Okay, that's called productive efficiency. Basically what it means is doing things in the right way. Allocative efficiency means producing the right amount, right? So if you produce in the right way, that's called productive efficiency. It means that you are being smart in your production process. If you produce the right amount, then that would be allocative efficiency for the right people. And that would be maximizing total surplus. So that's what you saw. Basically, we are going to focus more on allocative efficiency. That's more central in economics. Productive efficiency is more or less taken care of. You don't really need to worry much about it because the firms are profit maximizing. So the firms have the incentives to achieve productive efficiency anyway. The part that could be challenging is allocative efficiency. So are things being produced which are valued the most? Now, these two types of efficiency are maximized in a free market. So the cool thing, the magic of a free market is that they maximize our efficiency. Now, what is a free market? Free market is the interaction of buyers and sellers without government intervention. Okay, so there is no regulation imposed on them and you let them interact based on their own self-interest. That's called a free market, and it has a lot of cool features, as you already saw in the case of competition. Pause here. A monopoly creates inefficiency, which means the loss of total surplus. And we're going to look at this graphically. So we're going to compare and contrast competition with monopoly. This is quite an important sort of graphs, and you might need to rewatch it. I'm going to walk you through step by step. So let's start with the case of competition, which we've seen before, where you have supply and demand, and the point of their intersection is the equilibrium, right? So that gives us the quantity and the price. The C here stands for competition, right? So we're talking about a perfectly competitive market. So this is good old stuff that we know. Now, if you remember, we had consumer surplus, which is the area under the demand curve and above the price level. So that's the triangle. And there's another triangle, which is the producer surplus, which is above the supply curve, which is the cost curve, and below the price. Right? So again, this part is things that you've seen before. If you don't remember this much, then you really want to go back to your notes on consumer surplus and producer surplus. The part that's a little bit new is the monopoly part. So let's move on to the other graph. We have the marginal cost curve, which is the equivalent of a supply curve for a monopoly. And we have the demand curve for the market. Now, the point where the monopolist operates, if you remember, we had that condition of marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Yeah, you set those equal and then you find the quantity. Yeah, and we had a graph. We actually had a graph on this where we found the quantity of a monopolist, which is lower than the quantity of a perfectly competitive firm, and the price is a little bit higher. So this part of it is the part that might be a little bit tricky. Make sure you understand where these 2 points are coming from. There should be, just to simplify, I removed the marginal revenue line, but there would be a marginal revenue line which intersects the marginal cost curve at the quantity of a monopoly, right? But you've seen this before in another graph. Now, if you follow the same rule for consumer surplus and producer surplus, you will get a consumer surplus which is much smaller than the first one, right? And it makes sense because consumers are paying a higher price now. The price of a monopoly is higher than the price of a competitive firm or a market. And the producer surplus is a little bit bigger in this case. Now that kind of depends, but usually it is bigger. So the producer is benefiting at the expense of the consumers, right? Now we have that white triangle, which is a difference between these things, right? So the red shaded area now, that's called the deadweight loss. So that's the welfare cost of a monopoly. The total surplus in the case of a monopoly is smaller than the total surplus in the case of a competitive industry. Okay? A monopoly lowers social welfare, which is total surplus, not because of its higher price, but because of its lower quantity. This is somewhat important. When we talk about total surplus, we don't really care about how that is distributed. So even if all of that area is producer surplus, that's fine. I mean, we're still maximizing the pie. Maybe we are not being fair, but at least the size of the pie is maximized. The problem with the monopoly is that even the size of the pie is not maximized. We have a deadweight loss. So deadweight loss means that your pie is smaller than before. Okay? Pause here, do two nice graphs, try to make them side by side as you see, and if you can, color code them.